Hello everyone and welcome to Winshuttle Transaction Advanced 1 training. I am Miia from Adsotech, your Winshuttle partner in the Nordics, and I'm here to guide you through our 3 training packages, Basic, Advanced 1 and Advanced 2. These packages are designed for new Winshuttle Transaction users with a developer license. We are now in the Advanced 1 training package, which includes multiline recordings, reading from SAP, script linking, taking backups, and data validation. This is the first portion of that package where we will concentrate on multiline recordings, so using the loop feature. Let's dive in. The idea of multiline recordings is that in many SAP transactions we have multiple line items, meaning that we will have one set of header data and then we might have any number of line items attached to that header data. Good examples of SAP transactions might be FB50, so GL entries, FB70 for invoices, sales orders in VA01, purchase orders ME21N, and many others. So anything that has header data and then a changing number of line items. That's what we're talking about. What we do in Winshuttle when we create a script, we use something that we call a loop. What we want to create is one script that's able to process any different size documents. So we will be creating a script for GL entries in FB50, but we want that script to be able to process all kinds of GL entries, meaning GL entries that only have 2 line items, but also GL entries that have 5 line items, 15, 25, 33, 255 line items if it comes to that. So different size documents. And the problem with that, without the loop functionality, is that we would need to record a maximum number of rows individually, and then we would also have to map all of those line items individually, which would make our Excel template very wide. We would be using Excel columns all the way to XYZ. So we don't want to have that. We want to be able to dynamically decide how many line items we will have for each and every document. So that's where the loop comes in. The idea of the loop is that there's this one portion of the script, the entering of the line item, that we want to repeat and repeat and repeat for each and every line item. So if we have 15 line items, we want to repeat that line item portion of the script 15 times. But somehow we need to tell the system, we need to tell Winshuttle which part of the script is the part that we need repeating. And then of course we also need a way to tell the system how many times it needs to be repeated this time. And then for the next document, how many times for that. Well, the part where we tell how many times it needs to be repeated, that comes from Excel. But what part we need repeated, that comes from the script in the mapper. So we now need to look at the Expert tab in the mapper, where first of all, if you're not familiar with the Expert tab yet, let's take a look at that first. So we have these blue rows here. The blue rows tell us that a new screen, a new SAP screen starts. We get a screen name and some screen description as well. That's all there is on each of the blue rows. The white rows below each blue row are the content of that SAP screen, all the actions that happen in that SAP screen. Usually you have a cursor positioning there, as you have here in this picture on row 3. The description is indicates cursor position, and the field name is BDC_cursor. That's just about the cursor positioning on the screen. It's not that significant. In fact, we could take those out if we wanted to, at least in most scripts. What we also have in each screen is an OK code. If you look at row 4 here, OK code for this screen, BDC underscore OK code. That tells us how we move forward from this particular screen. Not in all screens, but in many of them, we also have some data going in. So we have some SAP fields that we have recorded in most screens. If you look at row 5 here, you see company code. That's an actual SAP field that we have recorded, and at this moment it has already been mapped as well, if you look at mapping type and value. Whenever you look at expert view, you should first be looking at the blue rows, so the screen rows. Those are listed in chronological order. So whenever we run the script, what needs to happen in SAP is that the first screen, beginning from row 2 here, that needs to pop up first. And then after that, the next screen should be the one that is presented here on row 6, and so on. Then if you look at the content, so the white rows below each blue row, that content there is not actually listed in a chronological order. When we enter a new SAP screen during the execution of a script, first the actual data fields get considered. I mean, if you look at rows 2 to 5, the company code update goes to SAP. That's the first thing that happens. And after that, the OK code is used, whatever code that might be. Over here, if you look at value field, it's equals ENTR. That code is used then to move on to the next screen. The OK code might be pressing enter on your keyboard, which probably this particular OK code is. Or it might be pressing some button in SAP, or it might be navigating to a different tab in SAP. It could be very many things. But the OK code tells us how to move forward from that screen. If it's just pressing enter in a certain screen in SAP might not actually get us physically to a new screen in SAP. It might just check through the data on that screen and still leave us in that screen. That's okay. But pressing enter still creates an OK code in our script, and each screen here can only have one OK code. So when we press enter, for instance, on our keyboard, it creates an OK code, and technically a new screen is created. Whether that new screen looks exactly like the previous one in SAP, so it is essentially the same SAP screen, or if we actually move on to a different screen, we get a pop-up, or we actually navigate to a different tab or whatever, that doesn't really matter. An OK code was created, so in a script sense, that screen stopped and we moved on to a different screen. This information will come in handy later on when we look at the looping. But this is how you read the expert view here. Now what we need to locate is the part where we have the line item. Over here it's already highlighted for us, so rows 11 to 19. In a little bit we'll go into more detail about how to actually spot that portion from the script. But the first steps that you are looking for, the first things that you are looking for are of course the line item data. So you're looking for, in this instance, fields like general ledger account or sales tax code and cost center and things like this. This is all line item data, so you're actually getting closer to finding the portion that needs to be repeated. What you do need to remember that when you are inputting, you're creating a loop here. You need to select the rows that need to be repeated, but you need to start that repetition from a blue screen row, and it needs to end just before a blue screen row. It can contain several screen rows, but it needs to start from a blue row and it needs to end before a blue row. So it cannot contain only white rows, and it cannot contain blue row, some white rows, and a blue row, and then end. No. It needs to contain complete screens, which again means that it needs to start from a blue row, from a screen row, and then it can contain several screen rows and several screens, but the end needs to be just before a blue row. For instance, here I cannot start my loop from row 11 and end it at row 17. That's not a complete screen. It needs to start from 11 and end at 19, or if we had different steps here, it might go from 11 onwards to contain the next screen and then end before another blue row. But over here it would be 11 to 19. So I select those rows simply by running my cursor, running my mouse on the far left side of the screen. So there is a gray area there. I can select my rows from there. And then when I have selected my rows, I will click Loop. There's a Loop button just above the SAP fields list, just above the script lines. So click the Loop button, and then you will get a pop-up. You have already selected the correct rows from your script, so you don't have to touch the start and end row at the top of your pop-up window. What you do need to consider is the three other fields that you see: your Excel ID column, your header ID, and your line item ID. First, the column. You will decide a column in your Excel template where you actually want to define what kind of data that particular Excel row contains, whether it contains header data or it contains the line items. With the loop functionality, we are able to avoid putting all of our line items on one row, so having them back to back on one row in different columns. We can avoid that because I would suspect most users to be annoyed with that. What we can do is we can list all of our line items underneath each other, actually list them on different rows. So the same data will always be on the same columns, but we will have different line items on different rows. And that's why we need this column. Let's say column A, as it states here. We will use column A to put in indicators, because we want to use several rows for one document now. Then we need to tell in column A whether this particular row in Excel will have the header data or it actually will contain line item data. So based on that, we will put in H's or D's onto column A in Excel. H and D are the most commonly used IDs or indicators that people use, so we can stick with those. If you choose to use something else, that's fine, but make sure that everybody in your organization, all the users of this script, also know what the indicators are if you decide to use something else. Very often also column A is used for this type of information. You can use some other column, that's fine, but again, make sure that your users know this. When you're finished with your settings, you click OK. Then what you see in your mapper is these icons on row 10 and 18 in this case. The picture here was taken from from a different script than the previous screenshot that we had. So don't worry about the actual line numbers that we have here. But when you have defined your loop, so you have selected your rows, you have clicked on loop, and then you have clicked OK in the pop-up window. What you see appearing here is these small icons. Those will tell you where your loop is and which portion of the script will be performed again and again and again to create new line items. On the Excel side, your script might look something like this, or your Excel file might look something like this. I was talking about the H's and D's just now, so let's start with those. Column A is used for the indicators H and D. On row 2 here I have an H. That tells both me and the system that that row will only contain the header data for my document. In this particular instance, it's only company code and the document date. Everything else is probably hard-coded as fixed values in the script. But that's fine. So we have the company code and the document date. Those are given on the H row here. Then after the H row, if we go down the rows, we have D's. So those are the line items for this particular document. There are 4 D's, so 4 line items. And of course on those rows we have columns D, E, F, G, and H filled in. So we have the GL account, debit credit indicator, the amount, sales tax code, and the cost center for each one of these rows. And Winshuttle will know to look for that data in these D to H columns because there's a D in column A. Once there are no more D's, so after row 6, Winshuttle will stop repeating that loop portion of the script and simply finish off by saving the data in SAP or whatever else we might have at the end of the script. Usually it is just the saving action. So we save the document and everything's fine, or should be fine, in SAP. Now of course Winshuttle will continue to check our Excel file. It will notice there's another H on the row 8 here in Excel. So it will start creating a new document, put in the company code and the document date, and then move on to the portion that gets repeated. So into the loop, start creating line items. Again, for some reason this document has only 4 line items, so it gets repeated 4 times. And then when there are no more D's in Excel, Winshuttle stops running that script. So it will finish off by saving the data and keep on checking the Excel file if there are further H's in the Excel file. In this case, there are no H's anymore, so the script stops running completely. In our Excel file here, we have row 7, which is completely empty. Some users like to have one empty row there in between the different documents. It helps them see the different documents better and get a clearer picture of the data. But we don't have to have an empty row there if we don't want to. We can simply have H's and D's and the data back to back on every single row, and that's fine for the script to work. But some users want to have one empty row there, or even 2, 3 empty rows. As long as you don't have 5 consecutive empty rows there, Winshuttle is still going to just jump over them and keep on processing the data. What you do need to remember when putting your data in this type of an Excel file is to actually make sure that you have the H's and D's correctly here in column A in this instance. Whenever you put in header data, you need to have an H there in column A. You have to have the correct indicator there. And for the line item data, again, you need to have the correct indicator there in column A. So D for the line items in this case. If there is no H or D, Winshuttle will not recognize that there's any data on that row, and it's not going to get processed. to SAP. And of course, you have to have an H row first, and then you can have D rows underneath that. And when a new document starts, you need to have an H row first, and then again, any number of D rows underneath that. Previously, when we were looking at the log message that we get from SAP to Excel, we got one message per row in Excel. Right now, our one transaction or one document is actually spread across several rows in Excel, and we can only get one message per document. It's the same for when we were getting when we had a script without a loop and we had log messages coming in per each row in Excel. Over there also we got one message per transaction, so per a whole action in SAP. Our examples were about material changes, so we were getting one message per material. Over here we are getting one message per document because we are actually creating documents. It just happens that our document, the data for our document, is spread across several rows in Excel, so it looks a little bit different here in the log column. If you look at your header row, so the H row, you see a message there. Document was posted, and so on. Some users like to see their message there on the header row, so it's printed there. But some of us also want to see it on the last item row, so it's copied down there as well automatically. So you see the message on both the header row and the last item row for each document. It's exactly the same message because it's just copy pasted down to both places. When and if you have some line items there in between, so basically you have more than one line item, then what the preceding line items say in the log column there is item row D, see log below. And that's normal. We see the actual message, the actual log message on the header row and the last item row, and anything in between you don't have to worry about. All right, what are we then doing in SAP when we record a script like this? There are some considerations that we have to think about. First of all, if we look at a FB50 transaction, for instance, here in SAP, this is a very normal looking, sort of standard type of a transaction. So if we have something with multiline, so we have line items, it's usually presented in SAP so that we have the header data up top, and then we have a list of line items on the bottom, as we have here as well. What we want to do is, well, first of all, we want to do the header data first. So enter that, just like you would, just like we have done recordings previously as well. After that, when you are ready to move on to the line items, you would need to try and find a button, something like insert line, add line, new, find line, find next, even filter. All of these might work. But you would need to try and do this before you actually start recording. Like we've just discussed before you start recording, you should be very aware of the steps and the fields that you want to record. So go to SAP manually first and investigate your transaction. Make sure that you know exactly the steps that you want to do, and then start your recording. So you don't have to re-record and re-record and re-record again because you made some silly mistake while recording. You're trying to find your buttons when you're manually in SAP. Also, when you find the button that you want, make sure that you know how that button works. Because very often a button like this, let's say insert line button, very often it produces an empty line as the first one in the list. But in some other transactions, the same looking button might actually work so that it produces an empty line as the second in the list. Sometimes we can't find a button that says insert line or add line. Sometimes we might need to use next page, last page buttons. And usually in those cases, we actually need to use the last line in the list. We just use the page down, next page, last page type of buttons to make sure that we actually get to the very, very end of the list. And then we use the last line in the perceivable list. Okay, let's look at more closely at FB50 transaction then again. So we fill in the header section first. We give a document date, a posting date, and possibly a reference or a document header text and things like that. Once we're finished with that, we want to press enter just once. Again, pressing enter creates a new screen in our recording, and that's what we want to happen before we start creating our line items. Now, when we start creating our line items, at this point we need to be very specific and very sure about the buttons that we are going to use. In FB50, we can do it like this. So we have an empty list of line items here to start with. We will put our cursor on line 1. We'll fill in that data. So we will put in an account number, a debit credit indicator, an amount, possibly a tax code and a cost center and things like that. Then we can hit enter. SAP will check the data. It's fine. Of course, it's fine because we knew exactly what we were entering. Then we select that line. And at this point, now we want to click our button. That's the insert line button, which is here on the bottom of our line items list, and it has the plus sign on that button. We will click that button, and what will happen is that existing row that we just created, it will get pushed down one row, and there's a new empty first row in our list, which we can use again. So we will start inputting our data, our second line item, onto that new first row, and we will repeat the steps that we just went through. So we will fill in the data, hit enter on our keyboard, select the line, and again press the plus sign button, the insert line button. We will do this at least for 2 line items. 2 is the minimum. You can do it to 3 or even 4, but when you're recording, I would suggest 2 or 3. 2 is, in FB50, 2 is even the technical limit, because if you don't do it for 2 rows, then you don't get a match between the debit and credit, and you're not able to save the document. But even if you're dealing with the sales order or something like that, where you are able to save a document with just 1 row, with just 1 line item, I would still recommend to create 2 line items. Just follow the exact same steps for each one. Input data, possibly press enter, select the line, and then press your button, and then do the exact same steps for the other one as well, all the way up to pressing the button, and then you save your document. Why do we need to do this twice? You will figure that out in the mapper, in the mapping phase. If you have done it twice, it will be much easier for you to see a pattern, a repeating pattern in your mapper, and it makes it much, much easier for you to know where to actually put your loop. So let's take a look. start a new recording. Non-batch without SAP controls is just fine for FB50. My initial screen in FB50 is actually this very small pop-up window that I see right here. It's asking for a company code, so I will give it. And now I see a bigger SAP screen with my GL account document data. First, enter the header data, so document date, posting date, and things like this. And same thing applies here as it does whenever you're creating a script for changing material or whatever. If you don't use your keyboard in the field, then that field does not get automatically recorded. So for instance, if you want the currency to be included in your script, you need to actually type something in that currency field. So you need to use your keyboard in one way or another. I just retyped euros as my currency because euros is the currency that I want to use anyway. I will also write something in the header text and reference fields here. Now I'm done with my header data. I want to press enter once before moving on to my line items. Done. Now the line items. I will start from row 1. Now to the line items. Input the data, press enter. I will select the row, click insert row here, and my existing data gets pushed down, and I'm able to use the first row in my list again for my next line item. Same thing for this line item, pressing enter, selecting the row, and hitting insert row, like that. Now I could enter a third line item, but I don't have to. But I will be ready to do that. So I have done the exact same steps for both line items, and even my credit and debit match, as I can see it from here, it's on green, so I'm ready to save my data. Save the document. In FB50, I get an extra information pop-up here telling me that this document was posted in this company code. Happy with that. Now SAP window closes, and I can wait for Winshuttle to have the control back. Okay, recording is done. Mapping needs to be done. So create mapping. In my basic view, of course, I have a list of all of those SAP fields that I used when I was recording. And on the bottom, I have an untitled Excel file. But in order to create my loop and things like this, I need to go to Expert View. So I'll click Expert. So over here, once again, I have blue rows like these. And those are so-called screen rows. So we have the screen name, the screen description. And those tell me that a new screen starts from there. The screens are listed in chronological order, so we start from that screen. This is the next screen, that's the next screen, and that's the next screen, and so on. The content of each screen is on the white rows. So for instance here, my very first screen in this particular recording in this script is that small pop-up window where I was asked for a company code. The company code, of course, it's being put in. Great. And then what happens is we use the OK code to move on to the next screen. The cursor positioning that we have here doesn't really matter that much. Winshuttle just needs a place to put the cursor, so it records the positioning as well. It doesn't really affect our script that much. Then over in the following screen, what happens is we have all these fields and the data for those fields that goes in, and then again we use the OK code to move on to the next step and next screen. So what we now need to do is figure out what is the portion of this script that we want repeated multiple times. So first we could be looking at simply the data that we had on the line items. Well, we have those here: GL account, debit credit indicator, sales tax code, and so on. If we go above that, if we take a couple of rows back into the previous screen, what do we have here? We have currency key, posting day, reference numbers, things like this. This is header data. So we know for a fact that this is not the portion that we want to repeat. But over in the next screen, we have some data that refers to the line items. And we know that our loop needs to start from a blue row. It needs to be complete screens. So we could say that, okay, there might be a loop that we want to start from row 14. But where does it end? If we scroll down a little, we know that anything above row 14 is header data, so we don't need to be looking at that right now. If you look at the values and the field names that we have here in this screen starting from row 14, if we look at these, we might notice that we have very similar values and very similar, actually exactly the same field names here in this screen also, starting from row 26. So that's repetition for you. There's one screen though there between them. Where does this screen belong to? Does it belong to the first line item or does it belong to the second line item? So if we start our processing here from row 14, we get all of this. Then we get this portion that we're not so sure about yet. And then it starts from scratch. It starts repeating again. Very similar values and exact same field names as we have on row 14 onwards. And then if we look further, the following screen, again, it's exactly the same steps as we have on rows 22 to 25. So what's our repeating pattern? It's from row 14 to row 25. And the same things happen from row 26 to row 37. So there we see the repetition that we were trying to create when recording. At this point, we might want to check what's following that. And there's only one screen after that, which is actually the saving action that we did at the very end. And that makes sense. I have now selected rows 14 to 25, and that's correct. We only want to select one line item. We have recorded two, but we don't want both of them to be repeated several times. We only want to have one in our script eventually and repeat that any number of times. So I will select one line item, all the steps that relate to that line item. So 14 to 25 at this point for my rows. They're so selected. I selected them using my Shift key on my keyboard. You can also do drag here, just dragging here with your mouse on the left side of the screen. That's fine as well. The lines are selected. I will click loop. Again, rows 14 to 25, that's fine. I already checked that. So then the Excel column and the actual IDs, the indicators that we want to use. Well, I personally like column A and indicators H and D, so I will go with those. Like that. Two things you should notice now. In column A on my Excel side here, I have reservation for the ID column, and also have the first indicators H and D printed here. The other thing that you should notice as well is these loop icons that I now have in my script. So the row numbering has changed a little bit because Winshuttle has added two empty rows here. One where the loop starts. There's one empty row here. The only content of that row is the actual icon. And there's another empty row right here as row 27. Again, somewhere to put the icon so we will see where the loop starts and where it ends. Now comes the tricky part, which people always forget, myself included. We have recorded two line items, and now we have loop around one of them. At this point, we don't need the other line item anymore. We only recorded it for two reasons. First of all, to see the repeating pattern, and in this case of FP50 transaction, we had to record another line item, otherwise our debit and credit won't match and we're not able to save the document in SAP. So for those reasons we have recorded two line items, but now we don't need the other one anymore because we have a loop which is able to run multiple times to create any number of line items. So what we need to do, again, we will select this other line item, just as we selected the previous one, but now we are concentrating on the second one. So we can select the rows, and behind your second button on your keyboard, you can right click you can find an option called Disable. Select that, and you will see that this tick box is now empty for all of these rows. You can accomplish the same thing by simply clicking each one of these tick boxes manually. That's fine as well. But this is exactly what you want to achieve. Empty tick boxes for these rows that belong to the second line item, because we don't need the second line item anymore. Now we are ready to do our drag and drop. So for that, I suggest that you flip back over to basic view, because it's simply easier to do it here. What we have done so far is, of course, the recording, but in the mapping phase, we have found the portion where we need the loop, we have created that loop, and then we got rid of the unwanted second line item by simply ticking off the enable tick box there. The enable tick box means that when it's ticked on, that particular SAP action or SAP field is actually an active part of the script. Now that we ticked it off, then that line item and all of those rows are not a part of the script anymore. We did not delete them, because if we delete them, we're not able to bring them back anymore. But if we disable them, like we just did, then it's fairly simple to bring them back if there are some changes that we need to make, and for whatever reason we might need those fields again. So disabling is just fine. But that has been done. Let's focus on the drag and drop. Of course, the drag and drop process does not change. We want the data to go from Excel to SAP, so we drag from Excel to SAP, and that's it. We just want to decide which columns to use. That's all my header fields that I have recorded. Of course, I could, if I wanted to, I could leave one of them as a fixed value, company code or currency key or something like that. I could use fixed values here if I wanted to, but I don't right now. The drag and dropping will be exactly the same for the line item fields as well. There's one very small difference, which you will notice when I start dragging or dropping the line item fields. The dragging and dropping itself is exactly the same, but you will notice a slight difference in the Excel file. Now, if you look at Excel here on the bottom, you will notice that all of the header data, the values are given on row 2 in my Excel file. And for the line items, the values are given on row 3, so the D row. And header data on the H row, of course. Winshuttle knows automatically which fields are inside the loop, and everything inside the loop needs to be on a D row. So that's why Winshuttle prints them automatically on the D row here. And the header data that is not inside the loop, of course, that gets printed on the H row. So that's pretty much the only difference with the dragging and dropping. There's no difference in what the user does, but Winshuttle puts the data in different places. I'm happy with my drag and drop with all my mapping actions. I will simply close mapping and save my files. Again, in the run window, mapping is done. We can go back to it if we need to change something. Let's open the Excel file to see what it looks like right now and add some data. We can add several documents or simply just add several line items. I will start by adding a couple of line items here. Let's add another document as well. I'm using very simple test data here, but that's enough for our purposes right now. Just some GL accounts, debit credit indicators, of course, so that and amounts so that our debit and credit could match per each document, and so on. Only 2 documents right now in my Excel template. So one starting from there, going all the way over to row 7, and then another document, slightly shorter document with 3 rows of line items. Save my Excel file just to be on the safe side. We can leave it open again, flip back over to Winshuttle, and run my script. I did not check if end row 11 is enough for it to cover all of my data, so I will simply change that to something bigger just to be on the safe side, and I will run my script. And now we see the messages in Excel. Again, for each document, one message. The same message is printed on the header row and on the last item row. And of course, the next document gets a message of its own, like that. We have some extra tips and tricks on our slides here. Let's take a look at those. Before you start recording your script, you probably have an idea that you're going to need a loop. So it's a multi-line thing that you're trying to accomplish here. So investigate the T code first. Make sure that you know how to make your steps repeatable, what button you're going to be using, insert line, find next, new, filter, things like this. If you're adding a new item onto the list, make sure that you're able to use the exact same physical position on the screen every single time for every single line item. Usually that means the first line, sometimes the second line in the list, or sometimes even the last line in the list. Usually the first, that's the most common case, as we had in FB50 as well. As I mentioned before, sometimes you don't have buttons like insert line, find line, filter, and things like this, but you might have the possibility of using a page down on your keyboard, or next page, last page type of buttons on your SAP screen. In some cases, you can use those buttons to ensure that your line is free. That in those cases, you probably use the last line in the list, and you can put your data there. We always recommend that you record at least 2 line item entries. Then it's easier for you to see and understand the repeating pattern in the mapper, and again, easier to put your loop around the correct portion. Do remember that whenever you put the loop around one line item, you need to disable the other line item, or 2 other line items if you have recorded 3 line items altogether. If you have a need to change existing line items, that's more difficult than adding new. At least usually that's the case. The problems arise from the fact that you need to locate the correct line item, and the ability to do that depends entirely on the T code that you're trying to use. For instance, in sales orders, so VA02, it's fairly simple to locate the correct line item. There's an actual search button for that list, so you can click that and give your search criteria, and then you will find the correct line item. But that's not the case in all transactions in SAP, so you might run into problems with that. Always remember that you cannot simply look at the list and just go and click one of those line items. There's no way for Winshuttle to know which line item, according to which criteria you actually looked for that line item. Winshuttle is a blind monkey going into these lists, meaning that if you have clicked on row 9 in a list, Winshuttle will always go to row 9 and do the changes or required steps there. So you need to use buttons or something similar to locate that correct line item. So we know that after that search functionality, the correct line will always be in that particular position on the screen, usually as the first line in the list. If there's no way of locating your correct line item in a list, absolutely no way of doing that through buttons or something else, some other functionality in the T code, then you will probably need something called index-based loop or index-based if, a feature that we only have available in GUI scripting recording mode. We're not going to go into that too much, but that's sort of your last resort if you're not able to locate your correct line item in an existing list. Another special case, if you know that you always have a maximum of, let's say, 3 rows of data in regards to this specific script that we're trying to create right now. So we're going to use this particular script to only create, say, sales orders that will have a maximum of 3 rows each. There's never more than 3 rows of line items. Then you might consider not using the loop at all, but actually simply recording 3 rows of line items individually. Meaning that when you are recording, you put your cursor on the first row, input your data, put your cursor on the second row, input your data, cursor on the third row, input your data. And that's it. Then you can save your document. That means that when you are mapping it, you need to map all the fields for all 3 line items onto your Excel template, and they will each field for each line item will be a separate column. So you will probably have the fields for your first line item in, let's say it's 5 columns, and then the next 5 columns will have the data for your second line item, and the following 5 columns will have the data for your third line item. So we'll map each field individually. What that does for you is for some users, it makes your Excel file look easier, because you then have individual fields for these individual line items and things like that. So it's just a matter of putting all of your data for one sales order on one row in Excel. It might be easier for some users. But 3 line items was your maximum, so you might use the same script for 2 line items and 1 line item as well. So you might need to consider using what we call the skip field indicator, or potentially adding some conditions into your script. Skip field indicator and the conditions are topics for the following training sessions, so let's not go into those either at this point. Just as a note for you guys out there, that you don't always have to use the loop. But if you have a random or dynamic number of line items going in, then it's very, very useful. But then again, if you have a very low number of line items, always, that's the, again, maximum of 3 line items, for instance, then you might consider not using the loop and just recording and mapping in the normal manner individually. So there are some ideas how to use the loop or when not to use the loop. And that concludes the first portion of our Advanced 1 package for Winshuttle transaction. Please join me in the next part, which will cover the download feature, so how to get data from SAP to Excel with Winshuttle transaction. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining.